of a child is the reversal of the natural order, an unbearable grief. For Helena, who had already buried two infant children, this loss was catastrophic. Yet even in the depths of her personal agony, the demands of her station required a public display of fortitude. She was a princess of the United Kingdom, and her grandmother was the Queen Empress. Her grief had to be managed, contained within the strict protocols of royal mourning. She received the news with the quiet dignity that had defined her entire life. But those close to her spoke of a light that had gone out, a profound and permanent sadness that settled upon her. She had poured so much of her hope and pride into her adventurous, capable son, and now he was gone. He was buried in South Africa, and Helena would never have the chance to visit his grave. The loss of Chrysal was a wound from which she would never fully recover, a silent sorrow that she would carry with her for the rest of her days. The death of her favorite grandson was also a terrible blow to the aging Queen Victoria. Now over 80 years old, her health was in a state of visible decline. The Boer War, with its heavy casualties, weighed on her conscience, and the loss of Chrysal seemed to sap her remaining strength. The turn of the century, the dawn of the 1900s, found the Queen frail and failing. During this final period, Helena's role as the dutiful daughter reached its somber crescendo. She, along with Beatrice, was an almost constant presence at her mother's side at Osborne House. Her days were now consumed with the intimate and draining tasks of caring for an elderly and dying parent. The grand duties of state had fallen away, replaced by the simple, profound human acts of providing comfort, reading aloud, and simply being present. Imagine the atmosphere in those final weeks of January 1901. The world held its breath, waiting for news of the monarch who had defined an age. But inside Osborne it was a family vigil. Helena would have sat by her mother's bedside, watching the formidable woman who had dominated every aspect of her 54 years of life, slowly slipping away. What thoughts must have passed through her mind? Grief, certainly, for the mother she loved, despite the suffocating nature of that love, but perhaps also a sense of the immense, seismic shift that was about to occur. Her entire life had been lived in service to this one woman, her home, her marriage, her daily schedule treaties, and maintained dynastic influence across the intricate tapestry of European monarchies. Every eligible princess was a potential bridge between kingdoms, a living embodiment of international diplomacy, and at the very apex of this sprawling empire, dictating its moral tone and shaping its destiny, was Queen Victoria herself. A widow by 1861, she retreated into deep mourning, cultivating an image of stoic sorrow that paradoxically intensified her authority. She was not just a monarch. She was the matriarch of a vast extended family that included not only her immediate children, but also numerous cousins, nieces, and nephews scattered across the royal houses of Europe. Her influence was not merely political, it was profoundly personal, permeating every aspect of her children's lives with an intensity that, by today's standards, would seem almost suffocating. She micromanaged their education, their social engagements, their health, and most crucially, their romantic prospects. Her letters, meticulously preserved, reveal a mother who was both deeply devoted and relentlessly controlling, a woman who believed she knew what was best for her children, even if it meant sacrificing their individual happiness for what she perceived as the greater good of the crown. Visual transition. A slightly younger portrait of Queen Victoria, perhaps from the early years of her marriage to Albert, showing her as a strong, intelligent, and determined woman. Then, a portrait of Prince Albert, conveying his intellectual and moral influence. Into this world, on May 25, 1846, at Buckingham Palace, Princess Helena Augusta Victoria was born. She was the fifth child and third daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The initial joy surrounding her birth was, as was often the case in large royal families, quickly subsumed by the demands of imperial life and the constant scrutiny of the public eye. Helena, affectionately known as Lenchen within the family, arrived at a time when the royal nurseries were already bustling. Her elder siblings, Victoria, the Princess Royal, or Vicky, Albert Edward, Bertie, the future Edward VII, and Alice already occupied significant positions within the family dynamic. Her younger sisters, Louise and Beatrice, would follow. The formative years of all Victoria's children were profoundly shaped by the educational philosophy of their parents, particularly Prince Albert. Albert, a man of immense intellect and rigid moral principles, believed passionately in an education that was broad, disciplined, and purposeful. He saw the royal children not merely as heirs, but as future leaders and exemplars of virtue. Consequently, Helena's early education was rigorous. Encompassing languages, German, French, and Italian, were standard. History, geography, mathematics, and the arts, including drawing, music, and painting. Governesses and tutors, often of German extraction, ensured a strict curriculum, with a strong emphasis on diligence and self-improvement. However, beneath this veneer of enlightened education lay a more subtle, yet equally powerful form of conditioning. The children were taught not just what to think, but how to behave, how to present themselves, and how to prioritize duty above all else. Obedience to their parents, particularly to their mother, was paramount. Victoria's expectations were immense, and her children were constantly aware of their royal destiny and the responsibilities it entailed. Helena, like her siblings, was raised in an environment where individual expression was often tempered by the demands of their station. Within the complex tapestry of the royal nursery, Helena occupied a somewhat unique position. She wasn't the brilliant, intellectually curious Vicky, destined for a grand future as Empress of Germany, nor was she the vivacious, rebellious Bertie, whose escapades caused his parents endless consternation. She wasn't the compassionate, sensitive Alice, who would later forge a deeply empathetic path in Hesse. Helena was, by many accounts, a quieter, more reserved child, perhaps less assertive than her older siblings. This wasn't a flaw, but rather a characteristic that, unfortunately, made her particularly susceptible to her mother's influence. While Vicky was groomed for intellectual leadership and Alice for diplomatic grace, Helena's early role began to crystallize around a different kind of duty: companionship. As the elder children grew and started their own lives, particularly after Vicky's marriage in 1858 and Alice's in 1862, the royal household began to feel emptier for the Queen. Victoria, profoundly dependent on her children's presence, unconsciously began to cast her remaining daughters in the role of perpetual attendants. Helena, being the next in line after Alice, gradually became more central to her mother's daily life. The sudden and devastating death of Prince Albert in December 1861 plunged Queen Victoria into a profound, almost pathological grief from which she never truly recovered. This event irrevocably altered the lives of all her children, but perhaps none more so than those who remained within her immediate orbit. Victoria retreated from public life, rarely appearing outside the palace walls, and demanded that her children, particularly her daughters, dedicate themselves to comforting her and fulfilling the duties that she herself now shirked. It was in this atmosphere of intense mourning and heightened maternal demand that Helena's role as the dutiful daughter truly solidified. She, along with her younger sisters Louise and Beatrice, became essential pillars of the Queen's secluded existence. They were her companions, her secretaries, her confidants, and often her emotional punching bags. The palace, particularly Osborne House and Balmoral, became places of quiet vigil,
where the queen's sorrow cast a long shadow over every aspect of life. For Helena, this meant a dramatic curtailment of any nascent independent life she might have hoped for. Her days were no longer just about lessons and decorum. They were about attending to her mother's needs, reading to her, writing letters at her dictation, accompanying her on carriage drives, and enduring her prolonged silences and occasional emotional outbursts.
This wasn't merely duty, it was an emotional entanglement of profound depth. Victoria, in her grief, clung to her daughters with an almost suffocating grip, demanding their constant presence and undivided attention. Biographers often note that while all Victoria's daughters felt the weight of her demands, Helena's placid nature, her willingness to comply, and her deep-seated loyalty made her particularly suited for this role. She was less prone to open rebellion than Louise, less emotionally fragile than Alice, who bore the brunt of comforting Victoria in the immediate aftermath of Albert's death before her own marriage, and older than the perpetually indulged Beatrice. Helena became in many ways the steady, reliable presence that Victoria craved. She adapted, she accommodated, and in doing so, she unwittingly began to lose herself. As Helena approached her 20s, the question of her marriage, an inevitable rite of passage for all royal princesses, began to loom large. For Queen Victoria, this was not merely a matter of finding a suitable husband. It was a continuation of her late husband Albert's grand vision for a united, peaceful Europe bound by familial ties. Victoria used her children, and particularly her daughters, as instruments to maintain German-British royal influence, a strategy often referred to as the Coburg Web, after Albert's family name. Each marriage was a deliberate political move, a reinforcement of alliances or a strengthening of dynastic connections. Helena, at 19, was still deeply embedded in her mother's life, a crucial figure in the mourning court. The idea of her leaving, of losing her constant presence, was deeply unsettling to Victoria. Yet the pressure to marry her off, to secure her future and fulfill her royal destiny, was undeniable. The search began, and it was fraught with complexities. Many suitable European princes were either already married, unsuitable for political reasons, or simply unwilling to meet Victoria's strict criteria for their prospective son-in-law, which often included remaining in Britain near the Queen. The eventual choice, Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, was, to put it mildly, unconventional, and raised more than a few eyebrows. Christian was a younger son of Duke Christian August II of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg, Augustenburg. Crucially, he was 15 years Helena's senior. But the bigger issue was his family's recent history. The Schleswig-Holstein question had been a simmering diplomatic crisis for decades, involving territorial disputes between Denmark and Prussia and Austria. Christian's family had been dispossessed of their ducal lands, aligning them with the German side in a conflict that had deeply involved Britain, albeit indirectly. To many, marrying into a dispossessed German family with such recent political baggage, and to a prince who was not particularly wealthy or high-ranking, seemed a step down, almost tasteless and old-fashioned, as contemporary critics put it. It certainly lacked the grandeur and political significance of Vicky's marriage to the future German emperor or Alice's to the Grand Duke of Hesse. It was seen as a decidedly unglamorous match, a marriage of convenience, not for grand dynastic expansion, but primarily for the convenience of Queen Victoria. Why then Prince Christian? The reasons are multifaceted, but all point back to Queen Victoria's needs. Firstly, Christian's family, despite their recent misfortunes, was still part of the broader German royal network Victoria so valued. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly for Victoria, Christian agreed to a critical stipulation. He would live permanently in Britain, near the Queen, and effectively become part of her household.
This meant Helena would not be whisked away to some distant European court, leaving her mother feeling abandoned. She would remain within arm's reach, available for companionship and duty. For Helena, the choice was not truly hers to make. Raised in an environment where obedience was paramount, where her own desires were secondary to her mother's will and the needs of the crown, she accepted. It's impossible to know the true feelings of a young woman caught in such a web, but one can imagine a mixture of resignation, perhaps a quiet hope for domestic peace, and the ever-present understanding that this was her royal destiny. There is little evidence of a passionate courtship or a deep romantic connection. This was a pragmatic arrangement, a dutiful alliance. Their engagement was announced in December 1865, and the wedding took place on July 5, 1866, at the private chapel at Windsor Castle. It was a relatively modest affair compared to previous royal weddings, again reflecting the circumstances of the groom and the Queen's continuing deep mourning. The ceremony itself was steeped in tradition, a public declaration of a private arrangement, witnessed by the highest echelons of British society. Helena, dressed in white, with orange blossoms in her hair, carried herself with grace and composure. Yet, beneath the serene facade, one wonders about the inner world of a young woman entering a marriage that was openly deemed tasteless and old-fashioned by her contemporaries. She was marrying not just a man, but a life, a prescribed existence dictated by her mother's design. Upon their marriage, Prince Christian was given the style of Royal Highness and made a Knight of the Garter, integrating him more fully into the British royal family. The couple was granted apartments at Windsor Castle, along with Schomberg House in London, and later the picturesque Frogmore House, also within the grounds of Windsor Home Park. This close proximity to the Queen was, of course, entirely by design. Helena and Christian went on to have 6 children: Christian Victor, Albert, Helena Victoria, known as Thora or Tarita, Marie Louise, Harold, who died in infancy, and an unnamed stillborn son. The arrival of children brought a new dimension to Helena's life, perhaps a source of genuine joy and personal fulfillment that had been somewhat lacking. She was a devoted mother, ensuring her children received a good education and were raised with a strong sense of duty, much like she had been, though perhaps with a softer touch than her own upbringing. However, the domestic tranquility Helena might have hoped for was soon overshadowed by new challenges. Prince Christian, as previously mentioned, was not a robust man. He suffered from various ailments throughout his life, including periods of ill health that required considerable care. Almost immediately after their marriage, Helena found herself shouldering the responsibility of tending to her ailing husband. This wasn't merely a wifely duty, it was a significant emotional and physical burden. She became his nurse, his companion, and his primary support system, managing his health crises alongside her own growing family and the relentless demands of royal life. This role as caregiver, while intensely personal, also had significant public implications. It meant Helena was even more tied to her home base, further limiting her independence and reinforcing her position within the Queen's immediate orbit. Her time was now divided between her children, her husband, and still, her mother. Despite her increasing domestic responsibilities and her husband's health concerns, Queen Victoria's expectations of Helena remained undiminished. In fact, they arguably intensified. Helena was still required to be a constant presence at court, to accompany her mother on numerous engagements, and to fulfill a growing list of public duties. She was, in many ways, the Queen's chief companion and unofficial secretary, often tasked with assisting Victoria with her voluminous correspondence and acting as an intermediary for her mother's various charities. Her life was a perpetual balancing act,
tending to a sick husband, raising a family, and serving as her formidable mother's unwavering aid. Yet, through it all, Helena never wavered in her commitment. She embraced her duties with a quiet dignity and an unfailing sense of loyalty. This unwavering devotion, however, came at a personal cost. Her letters, though guarded, sometimes hint at the sheer exhaustion she must have felt. There are subtle mentions of needing rest, of the ceaseless nature of her obligations, but never a direct complaint or an outright refusal. She was too well schooled in obedience for that. And then there was the ultimate constraint, her mother's implicit and often explicit prohibition against her leaving the palace or undertaking extended travel. While her siblings, such as Alice in Hesse or Vicky in Germany, forged lives in their own respective kingdoms, Helena remained tethered to Windsor. This was a deliberate choice by Victoria, who desired her daughter's constant proximity. Even when opportunities arose for personal excursions or much-needed breaks, they were frequently curtailed or outright denied by the Queen. "Mama needs me," was a phrase Helena likely uttered countless times, both to herself and to others. It was a justification, a resignation, and a simple statement of fact. Her life, for all its privilege, was one of perpetual availability, a life where her personal desires were consistently subsumed by the demands of her mother and the crown. She was the embodiment of the dutiful daughter, bound by invisible chains, forever within the Queen's shadow. A life defined by constraint can lead to one of two outcomes: a withering of the spirit, or the discovery of profound purpose within those very limitations. For Princess Helena, bound to Windsor and her mother's will, the gilded cage could have easily become a tomb for her aspirations. Instead, she turned her gaze outward, beyond the palace walls, to the suffering and needs of her mother's subjects. It was here, in the realm of philanthropy and service, that Helena, the dutiful daughter, began to forge an identity that was entirely her own. This was not a rebellion in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic confrontations or defiant stands. Hers was a quiet revolution, a channeling of her immense capacity for duty into causes that gave her life a meaning far beyond mere royal companionship. Her primary and most enduring passion was nursing. In an era when nursing was still struggling to be seen as a respectable profession for women, often viewed as little more than domestic service, Helena became its most powerful and dedicated royal champion. This was not a casual patronage, a mere lending of her name to a fashionable cause. It was a deep, personal, and lifelong commitment. In 1887, she became the founding president of the Royal British Nurses Association, an organization she would lead with unwavering dedication for the rest of her life. Her work with the association was transformative. She fought tirelessly for the professionalization of nursing, advocating for standardized training, better working conditions, and most controversially, a national register for qualified nurses. This last point, which seems like common sense today, was fiercely opposed by figures like Florence Nightingale. Nightingale, the legendary Lady with the Lamp, believed that nursing was a calling, a vocation that could not be quantified by exams and registers. She feared that professionalization would strip the profession of its compassionate soul. Helena, however, saw it differently. She understood that for nursing to be truly respected and effective, it needed standards, recognition, and a clear path for advancement. She saw registration not as a bureaucratic hurdle, but as a vital tool to protect both patients from unqualified practitioners and nurses from exploitation. She poured her energy into this cause, chairing meetings, writing letters, and using her royal influence to lobby politicians and sway public opinion. One can only imagine the scene: Princess Helena, a daughter of the Queen, calmly but firmly debating the future of a profession with some of the most powerful figures in the medical establishment. It was in these moments that she was not Lenchen, the queen's quiet companion, but a formidable leader in her own right. She hosted conferences at her own home, bringing together disparate factions to find common ground. This was her domain, her sphere of influence, carved out through sheer determination and a genuine belief in the cause. Her dedication extended beyond committee rooms. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, while her elder sister Vicky was on the German side, and her brother Bertie's wife Alexandra was Danish, with sympathies against Prussia, Helena helped establish the National Society for the Aid of the Sick and Wounded in War. This organization, a precursor to the British Red Cross, provided vital medical supplies and support to both sides of the conflict. Helena worked tirelessly, fundraising, organizing volunteers, and ensuring that aid reached those who needed it most. It was a tangible expression of her compassion, a desire to alleviate suffering that transcended the complex political allegiances of her own family. Helena's philanthropic vision wasn't limited to nursing. She was also a passionate advocate for the arts, particularly for crafts that provided women with opportunities for skilled employment. In 1872, she became the first president of the newly established Royal School of Art Needlework. Again, this was more than a ceremonial role. The school's mission was twofold: to revive the lost art of English embroidery, and crucially, to provide a respectable profession for impoverished gentlewomen who had fallen on hard times and had few other means of earning a living. Helena championed their work, promoting the school's creations and helping to secure prestigious commissions, including the altar frontal for St. Paul's Cathedral. She saw the beauty not just in the intricate stitches, but in the dignity and independence that skilled work could provide. She also took a keen interest in literature and translation. A fluent German speaker, she undertook the translation of several important German works into English. Perhaps her most significant project was the translation of the memoirs of Wilhelmina, Margravine of Bayreuth, the sister of Frederick the Great. This was a scholarly, intellectually demanding task that required not just linguistic skill but historical understanding. It was a quiet pursuit, undertaken in the precious few hours she could claim for herself, yet it reveals an active and curious mind, a desire to engage with the world of ideas that her formal education had fostered. These endeavors, nursing, needlework, translation, were the threads from which Helena wove a life of substance. They were her answer to the constraints of her existence, a testament to her belief that even a life lived in service to another could and should have its own intrinsic purpose. Yet while these public achievements provided an outlet for her talents, the private realities of Helena's life remained a constant and often heavy burden. The relentless demands of Queen Victoria did not abate. Living at Frogmore, a stone's throw from Windsor Castle, meant that Helena was perpetually on call. A summons from the Queen was not a request, but a command, and it could come at any time, disrupting family meals, personal plans, or moments of much-needed rest. Victoria's dependence on her was absolute. She relied on Helena for everything from companionship during her lonely evenings to assistance with the monumental task of sorting through Prince Albert's voluminous papers, a project that seemed to stretch on for decades, a constant act of remembrance that kept the grief of 1861 ever present. This proximity also meant that Helena's own family life was lived under her mother's intense scrutiny. Victoria took a proprietary interest in her grandchildren, offering unsolicited advice on their upbringing, their health, and their education. While this was born of a genuine, if overbearing, affection, it must have been incredibly difficult for Helena as a mother. She had to navigate the delicate balance of raising her own children while constantly accommodating the opinions and demands of their formidable grandmother. Adding to this was the ongoing concern for her husband's health. Prince Christian's ailments were chronic and often debilitating. He suffered from severe rheumatism and other health issues that left him in frequent pain and required constant care. Helena was his devoted nurse, managing his treatments, ensuring his comfort, and providing unwavering emotional support. This added yet another layer of responsibility to her already overloaded life. She was a princess, a public figure, a mother, her own mother's aide, and a full-time caregiver to her husband. The sheer weight of these roles is difficult to comprehend, and behind the public facade of dutiful composure, Helena was fighting her own private battles. She herself suffered from poor health, plagued by rheumatism and joint pain, conditions likely exacerbated by the damp English climate and the immense stress she was under. To cope with the chronic pain, she, like many in the Victorian era, turned to the common remedies of the day: opium and laudanum, its alcoholic tincture. This is a detail often glossed over in official biographies, but it is a profoundly humanizing and tragic one. Imagine the quiet desperation of a woman in constant physical discomfort, juggling an impossible number of duties, who finds a fleeting respite in a small bottle. Her reliance on these substances was likely not seen as an addiction in the modern sense, but rather as a necessary part of managing her chronic illness. Nevertheless, it speaks volumes about the unseen suffering she endured. The ever-composed princess, the pillar of strength for her mother and husband, was herself in need of care, a fact she likely felt she could never fully admit in a court that valued stoicism above all else. This hidden struggle adds a layer of deep pathos to her story, a reminder that the burdens she carried were not just emotional and psychological, but intensely physical as well. Her children were, without doubt, the central source of joy and meaning in her life. She was a deeply loving and involved mother. Her eldest son, Christian Victor, known as Chrysal, was a source of great pride. He chose a military career, a path that would take him far from the suffocating confines of the royal court and allow him to forge his own identity. Helena supported his ambitions even though it meant enduring long periods of separation and the constant worry that came with having a son in the army. She followed his career with intense interest, her letters to him filled with motherly affection, advice, and news from home. Her second son, Albert, would eventually succeed his father as the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, a complex and largely titular inheritance given the political realities of the time. Her daughters, Helena Victoria, Thora, and Marie-Louise, Louis, were her constant companions. In a poignant echo of her own life, they too would dedicate themselves to a life of duty and charity, remaining unmarried and becoming integral parts of the royal household, particularly after their grandmother's death. But motherhood for Helena was not without its profound sorrows. In 1876, she gave birth to her fifth child, a son named Harold. The infant was weak and lived for only 8 days. The loss was devastating. To lose a child is a grief unlike any other, and for Helena, who had dedicated so much of her life to caring for others, the inability to save her own son must have been an unbearable blow. A year later, she delivered a stillborn son. These successive tragedies, born with quiet dignity, added yet more layers of pain to a life already laden with responsibility. They were private griefs, endured within a family that, under Victoria's influence, was often discouraged from overt displays of emotion. Beyond her immediate family, Helena had to navigate the intricate and often fraught dynamics of her siblings. The 9 children of Queen Victoria were a disparate group, their relationships a complex web of affection, rivalry, and political disagreement. Helena, with her placid and diplomatic nature, often found herself in the role of mediator and peacemaker. She was the steady center, the one who maintained good relations with nearly everyone, even when they were at odds with each other or with the queen. Her relationship with her elder brother Bertie, the Prince of Wales, was particularly noteworthy. Queen Victoria harbored a deep and lasting disapproval of Bertie's hedonistic lifestyle, his gambling, his affairs, and his circle of friends. She largely excluded him from matters of state, a decision that would have significant consequences for his eventual reign. Helena, however, remained close to her brother. She understood his frustrations, and while not condoning his behavior, offered him a consistent and non-judgmental familial bond. She and Christian were often guests at Sandringham, Bertie's lively country estate, a world away from the somber atmosphere of their mother's court. This loyalty to her brother, in the face of their mother's stern disapproval, was a quiet act of independence, a demonstration that her devotion to Mama did not entirely eclipse her affection for her siblings. She was also a source of comfort to her sisters. She grieved deeply with the family when her sister Alice died tragically from diphtheria in 1878, a loss that shook the Queen to her core and placed even greater demands on her remaining daughters. She maintained a lifelong correspondence with her eldest sister Vicky, now the Crown Princess of Germany, sharing family news and offering support as Vicky navigated the treacherous political landscape of the German court. Helena was the reliable correspondent, the keeper of family ties, the quiet anchor in a family often rocked by scandal, tragedy, and political turmoil. Her position, physically close to the seat of power but politically neutral, allowed her to be a confidant to many, a role she fulfilled with her characteristic grace and discretion. Her life was a constant exercise in emotional diplomacy, balancing the needs of her formidable mother, her ailing husband, her growing children, and her often demanding siblings, all while carving out a public life of genuine substance and carrying the weight of her own silent suffering. As the 19th century entered its final decades, the world was accelerating at a breathtaking pace. The fin de siècle was an era of profound change, of artistic innovation, political upheaval, and social ferment. Yet within the hallowed halls of Windsor and Osborne, time often seemed to move to a different rhythm, dictated not by the march of progress, but by the slow, steady, and unyielding pulse of Queen Victoria's will. For Princess Helena, now entering her 40s and 50s, these years were a complex tapestry woven from threads of immense public pride and deep private sorrow. Her own children were stepping out onto the world stage, even as she remained firmly in her prescribed role as the steadfast anchor of the Queen's court. Her greatest source of pride, and indeed her greatest source of anxiety, was her eldest son, Christian Victor. Kreisel, as he was known in the family, embodied a spirit of adventure and a desire for a life of action that was a world away from the careful, constrained existence of his parents. He had chosen the army, and his career was a distinguished one, taking him to the farthest flung corners of his grandmother's empire. Helena, the ever-dutiful daughter, was now also the archetypal soldier's mother, her life punctuated by the arrival of letters from distant lands and the constant gnawing fear for his safety. His service record reads like a gazetteer of late Victorian military campaigns. He served in India, a land of mesmerizing beauty and ever-present danger. He fought in the Ashanti expedition in West Africa, a brutal campaign in a notoriously unhealthy climate. He was with Kitchener's forces in the Sudan, witnessing the Battle of Omdurman. For Helena, each of these deployments was a trial of faith. She would pore over maps, read newspaper accounts with a knot in her stomach, and wait anxiously for the letters that were her only connection to him. These letters, filled with his observations, his frustrations, and his reassurances,
were her lifeline. In her replies, one can sense the constant tension between her pride in his accomplishments and her deep-seated maternal fear.
She would offer advice, share family news, and gently remind him to take care of his health. The words of a mother reaching across thousands of miles, trying to exert a small measure of protection over a son engaged in the perilous business of empire. While Chrysal was forging a name for himself on the battlefield, Helena's other children were finding their own paths, though paths that were far closer to home. Her second son, Albert, was destined for a quieter, more diplomatic existence, eventually inheriting the complex and largely symbolic title of Duke of Schleswig-Holstein. But it was her daughters, Thora and Marie-Louise, who seemed destined to echo her own life's pattern. Intelligent, artistic, and deeply devoted to their family, they remained unmarried, gradually assuming the roles of companions and assistants, first to their mother, and then within the wider royal family. They dedicated themselves to charity work, becoming well-respected figures in their own right. But their lives were, in essence, a continuation of the tradition of service and sacrifice that Helena herself had perfected. One wonders if Helena looked at her daughters and felt a sense of pride in their devotion, or a pang of regret that they too were being drawn into the same web of duty that had defined her own existence. As her own family navigated these personal milestones, the British Empire itself was preparing for its most magnificent performances, the Golden and Diamond Jubilees. In 1887, the nation celebrated 50 years of Queen Victoria's reign. 10 years later, in 1897, the Diamond Jubilee marked her 60th anniversary on the throne, an unprecedented achievement. These were not just national holidays, they were global spectacles, carefully choreographed displays of imperial might and unity, designed to awe the world and reinforce the bonds of empire. Processions of troops from every colony, visiting heads of state, and extravagant celebrations transformed London into the undisputed capital of the world. For most, these events were a distant, glorious spectacle. For Princess Helena, they were an intensely personal and demanding reality. From her vantage point within the royal circle, she was not just a spectator. She was part of the intricate machinery that made it all happen. She would have been involved in the endless planning, the managing of foreign royal relatives who descended upon the palaces, and above all, the supporting of her elderly mother, the frail, black-clad woman at the very center of this maelstrom of celebration. Imagine Helena during the Diamond Jubilee procession, riding in a carriage through the cheering throngs. She would have seen the adoration in the faces of the crowd, felt the ground shake with the marching of soldiers, and understood, perhaps more than most, the immense symbolism of the moment. But her primary focus would have been on her mother. She would have been watching for signs of fatigue, ensuring the queen was comfortable, her mind occupied with the well-being of the 78-year-old monarch upon whom this entire global spectacle depended. For Helena, the Jubilee was likely a mixture of profound pride in her mother's achievement and the familiar grinding weight of personal responsibility. After the parades were over and the crowds had dispersed, it would be Helena, along with her sisters, who would be there to help the exhausted queen, to sit with her in the quiet of the evening, the echo of the cheering crowds fading into the familiar silence of the palace. The grand public triumphs of the Jubilees, however, could not hold back the private sorrows that were beginning to gather like storm clouds around the royal family. The Queen's court in these later years was increasingly a court of old age and mourning. The shadows were lengthening, and loss became a frequent and unwelcome visitor. In 1896, a devastating blow struck the heart of the family. Prince Henry of Battenberg, the handsome and beloved husband of Helena's youngest sister, Beatrice,
died of malaria while serving in the Anglo-Ashanti War in Africa, the very same campaign from which her own son, Chrysal, had thankfully returned. The death of Liko, as Prince Henry was known, plunged the family, and especially Princess Beatrice, into a grief that mirrored the Queen's own decades-long mourning for Albert. For Helena, this was a multiple tragedy. It was the loss of a brother-in-law she was fond of, but more profoundly, it was witnessing her youngest sister's life being irrevocably altered, suddenly transformed into a mirror of her mother's widowhood. Beatrice, like Helena, had been one of the Queen's essential companions, her marriage to Henry contingent on the couple remaining with Victoria. Now, she was a widow with young children, bound even more tightly to her grieving mother. Helena, the ever-present comforter, would have been a crucial source of support for her devastated sister,
Her own experiences with loss and caregiving providing a deep well of empathy. The event was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present threat of the imperial enterprise that her son was so enmeshed in. But the greatest personal tragedy of Helena's life was yet to come. In 1899, the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa. It was a brutal, costly conflict that would stretch the British Empire to its limits. Naturally, Prince Christian Victor, now a seasoned officer, was among the first to be deployed. Once again, Helena was plunged into a state of maternal anxiety, her days governed by the wait for news from the front. The news that came in the autumn of 1900 was not of a hero's death in battle, but something far more common and insidious. Chrysal had contracted enteric fever, typhoid, while stationed in Pretoria. For weeks his life hung in the balance. Helena would have received updates by telegram, each message a new source of hope or despair. She, a woman who had dedicated so much of her life to promoting nursing and medical care, was utterly powerless, thousands of miles away, unable to do anything but wait and pray. On October 29, 1900, at the age of 33, Prince Christian Victor died. The news was shattering. It was the ultimate cruel irony. Her beloved son, who had survived countless battles and perilous campaigns, was felled by a disease. For any parent, the death of a child is the reversal of the natural order, an unbearable grief. For Helena, who had already buried 2 infant children, this loss was catastrophic. Yet even in the depths of her personal agony, the demands of her station required a public display of fortitude. She was a princess of the United Kingdom, and her grandmother was the Queen Empress. Her grief had to be managed, contained within the strict protocols of royal mourning. She received the news with the quiet dignity that had defined her entire life. But those close to her spoke of a light that had gone out, a profound and permanent sadness that settled upon her. She had poured so much of her hope and pride into her adventurous, capable son, and now he was gone. He was buried in South Africa, and Helena would never have the chance to visit his grave. The loss of Chrysal was a wound from which she would never fully recover, a silent sorrow that she would carry with her for the rest of her days. The death of her favorite grandson was also a terrible blow to the aging Queen Victoria. Now over 80 years old, her health was in a state of visible decline. The Boer War, with its heavy casualties, weighed on her conscience, and the loss of Chrysal seemed to sap her remaining strength. The turn of the century, the dawn of the 1900s, found the Queen frail and failing. During this final period, Helena's role as the dutiful daughter reached its somber crescendo. She, along with Beatrice, was an almost constant presence at her mother's side at Osborne House. Her days were now consumed with the intimate and draining tasks of caring for an elderly and dying parent. The grand duties of state had fallen away, replaced by the simple, profound human acts of providing comfort, reading aloud,
and simply being present. Imagine the atmosphere in those final weeks of January 1901. The world held its breath, waiting for news of the monarch who had defined an age. But inside Osborne, it was a family vigil. Helena would have sat by her mother's bedside, watching the formidable woman who had dominated every aspect of her 54 years of life slowly slipping away. What thoughts must have passed through her mind? Grief, certainly, for the mother she loved, despite the suffocating nature of that love, but perhaps also a sense of the immense, seismic shift that was about to occur. Her entire life had been lived in service to this one woman. Her home, her marriage, her daily schedule, everything had been arranged around the Queen's needs. Now that central, gravitational force was about to disappear. For the first time in her life, Princess Helena was facing a future without Mama. On January 22nd, 1901, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Queen Victoria died. The Victorian age was over. For the nation, it was the end of an era. For Princess Helena, it was the end of her world as she had always known it. The shadow that had defined her existence had finally lifted, leaving her for the first time standing fully in the light, blinking into an uncertain future. The world, it seemed, had stopped turning. For 63 years, Queen Victoria had not merely reigned, she was the era. Her death was more than the passing of a monarch. It was the closing of a book, the fall of a curtain on a world that many believed would last forever. For the millions who lined the streets of London, heads bowed in silent reverence, it was the loss of a national symbol, the great grandmother of Europe. But for Princess Helena, standing amidst the solemn pageantry,
The grief was infinitely more personal and complex. The central pillar of her universe, the gravitational force that had dictated the orbit of her entire existence for 54 years, was gone. The funeral was the last great pageant of the Victorian age, a final gathering of the old world order before it would be swept away by the coming century. Helena played her part with the stoic grace that was her hallmark. She stood with her siblings, a united front of royal mourners, their black attire a stark symbol of the end of an epoch. But beneath the veil of public duty, a profound and disorienting internal shift was taking place. The lifelong mantra of "Yes, Mama" had suddenly fallen silent. The constant demands, the suffocating proximity, the unwavering expectations, all had vanished. For the first time, Helena was truly on her own, a princess without her queen, a daughter without her defining purpose. This was not the exhilarating rush of liberation one might imagine. It was the quiet, unsettling void of a life's primary function suddenly rendered obsolete. The transition was immediate and absolute. As soon as the period of deep mourning was over, the heavy, somber curtains of the Victorian court were thrown open, and the dazzling, champagne-fueled light of the Edwardian era flooded in. Her brother Bertie, now King Edward VII, was the polar opposite of their mother. Where Victoria had been reclusive, moralistic, and steeped in the past, Edward was sociable, pleasure-loving, and thoroughly a man of his time. He was determined to modernize the monarchy, to bring it out of the shadows and back into the glittering heart of high society. The court was transformed overnight. The stuffy German-inflected sobriety of Victoria's Windsor was replaced by the glamorous, French-influenced sophistication of what was known as the Marlborough House set, the king's circle of wealthy, fashionable, and often racy friends. Life at court was no longer about quiet evenings and dutiful correspondence. It was about lavish weekend parties at country houses, extravagant dinners, gambling, and a social world that was both exhilarating and ruthless. It was a world that valued wit, wealth, and novelty above all else. And in this new, glittering world, Princess Helena and her husband, Prince Christian, were anachronisms. They were living relics of the previous age. Their quiet dignity, their devotion to duty, their preference for a sober domestic life, these were not currencies that held much value in the court of Edward VII. Helena, who had been at the very heart of her mother's court, now found herself on the periphery. She was respected, of course, she was the king's sister, but she was no longer central. She and Christian were seen as emblems of the old guard, a bit staid, a bit dull, a bit too Victorian. This marginalization was subtle, but pervasive. The new queen, Alexandra, while publicly gracious, had always harbored a degree of coolness towards Helena's husband. The Schleswig-Holstein issue, the very thing that had dispossessed Christian's family, had been a deeply painful political conflict for her native Denmark. While this was politics of a previous generation, these old wounds had a habit of lingering in the intricate memory of royal families. Alexandra, a celebrated beauty and international fashion icon, set the tone for the new era, and it was a tone that did not naturally include her quiet, dutiful sister-in-law. Helena, now in her mid-50s, was not one to compete in the dazzling social games of her brother's court. She did not have the glamour of Alexandra, the artistic rebelliousness of her sister Louise, or the youthful energy of the next generation of princesses. Her life had been one of substance over style, and she was not about to change. She continued to live at Frogmore House, her beloved home on the Windsor estate, which now felt like a quiet island of Victorian calm in a sea of Edwardian excess. She and Christian would attend the necessary state functions, coronations, state openings of parliament, diplomatic receptions. But they were no longer insiders. They were esteemed relatives, wheeled out for formal occasions, but the real energy and influence of the court had moved elsewhere, to circles in which they did not belong. This new reality, however, may have contained a silver lining, a quiet and unacknowledged freedom. With her mother gone, Helena was finally the undisputed mistress of her own daily life. There were no more sudden summons to the castle, no more endless hours spent reading aloud or sorting papers. Her time, for the first time, was truly her own. She could devote herself more fully to her husband, whose health was becoming increasingly precarious, and to her two unmarried daughters, who had become her constant companions. A poignant, cyclical pattern emerged. Just as Helena had dedicated her life to her mother, her daughters, Princesses Thora and Marie-Louise, now dedicated their lives to her. They did not marry, instead choosing a life of royal duty and charitable work, acting as their mother's assistants and companions. Frogmore became a distinctly female household, a sanctuary of quiet routine, music, correspondence, and devotion to their various causes. It was a life of purpose, but it was also a life contained, a continuation of the model of female royal duty that Helena herself had exemplified. The shadow of Queen Victoria may have lifted, but her legacy of selfless, contained service lived on through her granddaughters. It was during these quiet Edwardian years that Helena's true legacy, her charity work, solidified. Freed from the constant demands of the court, she could pour even more of her considerable energy into the organizations she cherished. She remained the energetic president of the Royal British Nurses Association, continuing her fight for the profession's recognition. She was a tireless leader for the Royal School of Art and Needlework, and a patron of countless other hospitals and benevolent societies. This was her work. It was her passion. It was the sphere in which she was not a marginalized princess, but a respected and effective leader. While the fashionable set partied at Sandringham, Helena was chairing committee meetings, visiting hospital wards, and making a tangible difference in the lives of ordinary people. In a world that had seemingly passed her by, she had found a way to remain profoundly relevant. The passing years also brought the inevitable sorrows of aging. The health of her husband, Prince Christian, continued to decline. Now in his 70s, he was often in considerable pain. The couple made frequent trips to European spas in search of remedies and relief, a common practice for the afflicted aristocracy of the time. These journeys, while undertaken for health reasons, also offered Helena a measure of the freedom to travel that had been denied to her for so long under her mother's reign. Yet, they were always shadowed by the reality of her husband's suffering. She was, as she had been for decades, his primary caregiver, her life attuned to the rhythms of his illness. In 1910, another era came to a sudden end. Her brother, King Edward VII, died after a reign of just 9 years. The brief, glittering Edwardian age was over. His death was a shock to the nation and to the family. For Helena, it was the loss of the brother she had always been quietly loyal to, the boy she had grown up with. Even as their adult lives had diverged so dramatically, she mourned him deeply, another link to her past, another pillar of her generation, now gone. With the accession of her nephew, King George V, the tone of the court shifted once again. George and his wife, Queen Mary, consciously rejected the flamboyance of the Edwardian era, favoring a more modest, duty-bound style that was, in many ways, a return to the values of their grandmother, Queen Victoria. For Helena, this new court was perhaps more comfortable in its temperament, yet it also cemented her status as a figure from a distant past. She was now the venerated aunt of the king, a living link to the legendary Victorian age, but her active influence was minimal. She was now approaching 70. She had lived through the zenith of her mother's empire, had witnessed the dawn of a new century, and had buried parents, siblings, and, most painfully, a son. Her life had been one of quiet endurance, of storms weathered with a placid and unshakable sense of duty. She had found her purpose not in the grand halls of power, but in the quiet corridors of hospitals and the busy workrooms of her charities. But as she settled into what should have been a peaceful old age, the world outside her quiet sanctuary at Frogmore was growing darker. The intricate web of royal cousins and dynastic marriages that her mother and father had so carefully constructed to ensure peace was beginning to fray. The political tensions in Europe were escalating, nationalism was on the rise, and a new, terrifying arms race was underway. Her nephew George was King of England, but another nephew, Wilhelm II, was the German Kaiser. The family was on a collision course with itself, and the world was being dragged along with it. The final and most terrible test of Helena's life was looming on the horizon, a global conflict that would pit cousin against cousin and tear her Anglo-German world apart forever. The summer of 1914 was the last summer of the Old World. The intricate, fragile piece of Europe, held together for decades by a complex web of treaties and familial ties, shattered with breathtaking speed. For most in Britain, the declaration of war against Germany was a matter of national honor and patriotic duty. But for Princess Helena, and for the entire British royal family, it was an unimaginable catastrophe. It was a civil war. This was not a conflict against a distant, faceless enemy. It was a war against their own blood. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, Helena's nephew. King George V of the United Kingdom was also Victoria's grandson, Helena's nephew. The Empress of Russia was her niece. Countless other cousins, nephews, and in-laws were scattered throughout the German principalities, now officially the enemy. The Coburg web, Prince Albert's great dream of a united, peaceful Europe bound by family, had become a tangled, bloody net, trapping them all in a nightmare of divided loyalties. For Helena, a woman whose entire identity was a blend of her British birth and her German marriage, the war was a personal crucifixion. True to her nature, Helena did not retreat into private grief. As the nation mobilized for war, She threw herself into the work she knew best, caring for the sick and wounded. At nearly 70 years old, she channeled her anguish into action. Her long-standing work with nursing and the Red Cross now took on a desperate urgency. She helped to organize hospital trains, visited convalescing soldiers, and lent her name and her tireless energy to countless fundraising efforts. She became a familiar, comforting presence in the hospital wards, speaking to the young men whose bodies had been broken in the fields of France and Belgium. One can only imagine the turmoil in her heart as she sat by the bedsides of British soldiers, wounded by German guns that were commanded by her own nephew. Every casualty was a fresh wound to her divided soul. Her own son-in-law, Prince Aribert of Anhalt, was a German prince. Her daughters, Thora and Marie-Louise, who were on a visit in Germany when the war broke out, had to make a harrowing journey home, suddenly finding themselves in enemy territory. The war was not an abstract political event. It was a schism that ran right through the heart of her own family. As the war dragged on and the casualty lists grew ever longer, a wave of intense anti-German sentiment swept across Britain. Anything with German associations was viewed with suspicion and hostility. German shepherd dogs were renamed Alsatians. Sauerkraut was called Liberty cabbage, and the royal family, with its distinctly German name of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, found itself in an untenable position. In 1917, in a brilliant act of public relations and a profound personal sacrifice, King George V made a historic decision. He renounced all German titles and dignities for himself and his family and adopted a new, quintessentially English surname, Windsor. This decision had immediate and dramatic consequences for Helena and her family. They too were required to relinquish their German heritage. By royal warrant, Prince and Princess Christian of Schleswig-Holstein ceased to be. Their territorial designation, the name that had defined their marriage and their identity for over 50 years, was erased. They were to be known simply as Their Royal Highnesses Prince and Princess Christian. Their daughters became Princess Helena Victoria and Princess Marie-Louise, with no German title. It was a necessary act of political survival, a public declaration of undivided loyalty to Britain. But for Helena, it must have felt like the final, brutal severing of her past. Her marriage, her husband's identity, the very name her children carried, all had been sacrificed on the altar of war. She accepted it, as she accepted all duties, with quiet resignation. But the personal cost is impossible to overstate. Amidst this national identity crisis and the ongoing slaughter of the war, Helena faced her final, most intimate loss. Her husband of 51 years, Prince Christian, passed away at Schomberg House in London in October 1917. Theirs had been a marriage born not of passion, but of dynastic convenience. He was the older, penniless prince chosen to keep her tethered to her mother. Yet, over 5 decades, their relationship had deepened into a partnership of genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared experience. He had been her constant companion, the co-architect of her quiet domestic life, the father of her children. She had been his devoted caregiver, his unwavering support through years of ill health. Now, in the darkest days of the war, he was gone. She was now truly alone, a widow at 71, her world utterly and irrevocably changed from the one into which she had been born. When the war finally ended in 1918, the world was a graveyard of empires. Her nephew, the Kaiser, was in exile. Her other nephew, the Tsar of Russia, had been brutally murdered along with his entire family, including Helena's niece, the Empress Alexandra. The Europe of her youth was gone forever, replaced by a new, uncertain, and often violent world. Helena lived on for 5 more years, a quiet, dignified matriarch in a world that had largely forgotten her. She continued her charity work, A constant, steady presence even as her own health began to fail. She was a living link to a bygone era, a quiet repository of memories of a world of horse-drawn carriages, of visits from foreign emperors who were also her cousins, of a time when the map of Europe was a family tree. She passed away peacefully at Schomburg House on June 9, 1923, at the age of 77. She was the last surviving child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to have been born while her grandfather, King Leopold of the Belgians, was still alive. Her death was the final quiet closing of a chapter. So, what is the lasting significance of Princess Helena? She is not remembered for her beauty, for a dramatic romance, or for wielding political power. Her story is quieter, more subtle, and perhaps for that reason, more profound. She was the quintessential, dutiful daughter, a woman whose life was circumscribed by the immense shadow of her mother, Queen Victoria. Born into a gilded cage, her freedom was sacrificed for the convenience of the crown. Her choices made for her. Her life lived in service to others. And yet, within that cage, she did not wither. She found her own form of freedom, the freedom to serve. In a world that sought to define her solely by her royal birth, she defined herself by her work. Her tireless advocacy for the nursing profession left a tangible, lasting legacy, helping to transform it from a lowly service into a respected career. Her compassion and her dedication to charity touched countless lives. She was a woman who endured immense personal tragedy, the loss of children, the chronic illness of her husband, the agonizing divisions of war, with a quiet strength and an unwavering sense of duty that is almost impossible to comprehend today. Her life is not a fairy tale. It is a deeply human story about the contradictions of life, of immense privilege and profound constraint, of public duty and private suffering. It is a lesson in the fragile beauty of a human spirit that, denied the chance to soar, instead chooses to grow deep roots, finding purpose and meaning not in what it can acquire for itself, but in what it can give to others. Princess Helena may have lived in the shadow, but hers was a life of quiet, undeniable, and enduring light.